Although the information in this film can be applied worldwide because UFOs and UAPs are indeed a worldwide phenomenon, it is prudent to concentrate on what has emerged from the United States because it is well documented. Therefore, this information is based on what is acknowledged by most serious researchers as being within the realms of what is both possible and extremely likely. As we will see, the subject can be broken down into two quite distinct strands: the physical manifestation of extraterrestrial spacecraft and their occupants, and the non-physical manifestation of what may be truly nefarious, as we will see. This is where the Collins elite find relevance. This is important because once you start to go down this extremely slippery rabbit hole of claim, counterclaim, lies, and deception, all sorts of unexpected side avenues emerge, and some of them are probably best left unexplored. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you." And the subject of ufology is indeed a deep, dark abyss. And once you start looking, really looking, the psychological fallout can be genuinely unsettling and can have utterly terrifying spiritual consequences. Because, as we shall see, the objects we see in the sky and what may be inside them could be extremely dangerous and really could come from the depths of the abyss. That said, we should never lose sight of the fact that we are indeed being visited by entities that are not of this world. But the danger lies in the possibility that they do not originate from any recognizable civilization as we would understand it, and that in some cases, they appear to be non-physical. A word of warning, though. Keep in mind that much of this way of thinking is derived from fundamentalist theology, which tends to base its opinions on hellfire interpretations of Scripture. Ufology and the Collins elite. Since the inception of modern ufology in the 1940s, the field has been beset by various ideas and opinions about what UFOs are, where they originate, and perhaps more importantly, who or what they contain. Some of these ideas are reasonable, but others are less so, and go down a much darker and worrying route. According to the most commonly accepted belief, UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft originating in far-off star systems that visit our planet for a whole host of reasons. Some of the reasons are allegedly altruistic and benign, and some considerably less so. But at the core of this particular subset of opinion called the extraterrestrial hypothesis lies the conviction that all UFOs, irrespective of their point of origin, are nuts and bolts flying machines piloted by beings that seem to be more or less humanoid in appearance. This is valid, but it seems to largely ignore many other important aspects of the phenomenon. For example, these objects and their assumed occupants can appear and disappear at will, pass through solid walls, can manifest to individuals in a group while remaining invisible to some group members, and a wide array of other attributes that seem to owe more to ghost activity and other spiritual manifestations than anything else. However, those who accept the ETH as the only explanation claim that this is due to the ETs possessing vastly superior technology to ours, rather than any paranormal attributes. And that said, it is arguable that any display of some aspects of an unfamiliar technology, as the late Arthur C. Clarke rightly pointed out, might well be viewed as either being paranormal or like magic. On the other hand, there are a small number of groups who insist, rightly or wrongly, that UFOs and their occupants are not physical in any accepted sense at all, but are in fact manifestations of Satan and his demonic lieutenants. According to this paradigm, the purpose of these UFOs is the ultimate destruction and spiritual ruin of the human race, and those who promote this concept claim that their ideas stem from what they believe is the ultimate source of all undeniable truth, i.e., the Holy Bible, which they quote at length to substantiate their claims. This also ties into the supposed corruption of the human race eons ago by the fallen angels. Were they ETs, perhaps? As mentioned in Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Something similar also appears in Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Again, in Ephesians 2:2 we find, wherein in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. Elsewhere, Scripture also says, Jesus created things seen and things unseen, visible and invisible, as the powers and principalities of the air, and that these very powers of the heavens would be shaken as we neared his return. These ancient biblical warnings, particularly the mention of the powers and principalities of the air, always tell us in direct terms to beware, and this last example seems to infer that a final battle for the future of the human race is in the offing. And these powers and principalities refer to demons and or the hosts of hell who intend to enact it. While this is well and good, if we accept this as valid, we inevitably encounter a race of fearsome ancient hybrids, i.e. the demonic Nephilim, who were allegedly the mutant offspring of human women and the fallen angels. These Nephilim exacted a terrifying toll on humankind until they were exterminated. Might this have been a battle between extraterrestrials or something much more sinister? However, rather than anything sacred, we must ask ourselves, is the use of the term fallen angels simply code for ETs, or something else which is much more insidious and incredibly dangerous, and, in itself, threatens the very existence of the human race? Tradition teaches us that these Nephilim are the giants mentioned in the Bible. This is the same mindset that also embraces concepts such as the machinations of the New World Order and the Illuminati. As with the UFO phenomenon in general, it is open season for any idea one wishes to attach to it, and some of these ideas may be correct. In addition, there is an even less well-known strand of belief from a similar source, saying that UFOs, while still spiritual, are created and crewed by angels, so you pretty much embrace whichever belief system is closest to your own point of view. Even more importantly, it also strongly hints that Jesus might well have been an ET, which in this context would make perfect sense. From this, it is obvious that, while UFOs and ufology may be relatively marginalized belief systems, there is sufficient scope within them for various strands of belief to grow and develop. This becomes valid if one considers that some mediums and psychics claim to be in contact with entities from the void. These entities not only claim to be extraterrestrial, but astonishingly, also come from where souls are created. What does that mean? What are the implications? And what does it tell us about the soul? If souls are created, does this mean that the soul is some kind of exotic spiritual device implanted into humans? Or is there another meaning? It is fair to say that many psychics and mediums are exceptionally talented individuals, and when in a trance, they only act as communication devices for whatever is speaking through them. In a sense, they become possessed, which is why it can be a dangerous thing to pursue without adequate training, and is also why psychic mediums are sometimes viewed with some suspicion. However, it is also known that these entities, if nefarious, do not always necessarily tell the truth and seek to confuse and misdirect us for their own ends. This is something that has previously been commented on by other serious and open-minded UFO researchers. Unfortunately, within the UFO community, there is a surprisingly high level of intolerance to any thoughts or opinions that fail to stay within the surprisingly narrow ET mindset. Before moving on, perhaps we should consider a few of the cornerstones of ufology as it is generally accepted. As far as we are concerned, modern ufology as we know it started during World War II, with the sighting of what became known as Foo Fighters. These were balls of light that began to follow bombers as they flew on various missions over Nazi Germany. They were assumed to be some kind of secret weapon developed by the Nazis. However, they were also seen by the crews of Luftwaffe aircraft who came to the same conclusion, except they attributed them to Allied technology. Even today, there is no consensus about what they were, what they wanted, or who sent them. Nor have Foo Fighters been seen since, which is a very interesting point, and perhaps is a clue to the UFO enigma. The only unifying aspect of this is that sightings of anomalous objects in the sky still occur right to the present day, where there is any major conflict. UFOs were encountered and even engaged during the Vietnam War, and even the present conflict in the Ukraine has produced claims that UFOs were seen flying over Lviv on March the 7th, 2022. In fact, it has been suggested that the real reason that Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place was to get possession of a giant alien spacecraft, whose existence would be confirmed when it rose from its underground hangar and ascended into the sky. Just how valid this remarkable claim is remains to be seen. But given the level of technology currently used in modern battlefields, especially with the use of drones and theorized back-engineered alien craft, it seems just about anything is possible. Going back to the origins of these sightings, we return to 1947 and the famous sighting by Kenneth Arnold as he flew over Mount Rainier and saw what looked like aircraft that skipped like saucers skimming over water. It was, of course, this quote that later entered the lexicon as flying saucers. This was followed shortly after with the granddaddy of all the UFO encounters, and that was, of course, the world-famous Roswell crash. However, what is not realized is that all of these events are connected, and the connection may lie in captured Nazi technology. What Arnold saw was almost certainly the Northrop version of a flying wing, the HO-229, designed by the Horton brothers, Walter and Reimar. Because of its relative invisibility on radar, the design was eventually dubbed Hitler's stealth fighter, and a partly built example was taken to the USA as part of Operation Paperclip at the end of World War II, and given to the Northrop Corporation because they had been working on flying wings of their own. Given what Northrop finally produced, compared with the clipboard drawing often shown with Arnold pointing at it, the images are almost identical. Then there is what also crashed in June 1947, this time at Roswell, New Mexico. According to the investigative journalist Annie Jacobson in her book Area 51, The Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base, this was undoubtedly a flying disc and not any kind of crashed weather balloon. The crash debris was taken to Roswell Army Airfield, and a statement was issued shortly after when Walter Haut, a press officer from the airfield, took a message to the local newspaper saying that a crashed disc had been recovered and had been taken to the airfield. This was the same individual who, a few hours later, took another message to the same newspaper retracting the first statement. This second statement carried the message about the now infamous crashed weather balloon. Haut later signed an affidavit to be revealed after his death, and the document said that a disc had been found and was taken to the airfield, and the second press release was designed to cover it up. He also said that small bodies had been recovered from a second crash site. The same small, almost childlike bodies had unusually large heads, and he went on to say that he was convinced they were not human. Again, there is no official explanation for any of this, and it remains classified to this day. It is believed that these bodies may have been the handiwork of the SS officer Dr. Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, who conducted horrific genetic experiments on prisoners, especially twins, in the SS-run death camps, particularly Auschwitz. Mengele eventually drowned in 1979 after suffering a stroke while swimming. He was buried using the false name of Wolfgang Gerhard. As far as the crashed disc was concerned, Air Force personnel went inside it at the crash site and noticed that there was Russian Cyrillic writing around the interior of the disc. So it was little wonder that the disk was quickly removed from sight and its existence totally erased from history, as indeed to this day it still is. The disk did not come from outer space. It came from Russia, again as a direct result of the Russian version of Project Paperclip, because they also, like the USA and other Allied forces, grabbed as many Nazi scientists as they could, and for the same reasons, to obtain advanced technology before the Russians did. This involved nuclear secrets, because the Nazis had also been investigating the power of the atom and were not far from creating their own atom bomb. It is believed that the Roswell disk was remote-controlled and was specifically intended to send a clear message from the then USSR to the USA. That although the USA was ahead in nuclear technology, the USSR had other important technology that they did not have, and that included the means to make the disk fly and hover. Again, this came from the Nazi scientists they had captured in the end of World War II, because it is known that the Nazis had been working on disc-shaped aircraft that used a unique form of propulsion. As mentioned at the beginning, from what we have seen so far, there appears to be two distinct strands to the UFO/UAP saga. One is purely technology-based, and the other is not. Although officially denied, ridiculed, and rejected by most governments and intelligence agencies, this ridicule conceals a very deep-rooted concern that UFOs and what they represent do indeed have much more basis in reality than they dare to admit. This has been evident in the various governmental attempts to prove or disprove the phenomena one way or another, especially in the USA. In the USA, projects like Grudge and Blue Book, the formation of the Robertson Panel and the Condon Report, etc., are all examples of the effort to cloak the reality of UFOs, and it has been argued that what emerged from these groups was nothing more than propaganda using disinformation, misinformation, spin, and barefaced lies. One then has to ask why. What is there to fear from the truth? And the answer is nothing, apart from admitting that the government of any given nation cannot prevent these craft from flying around at will with impunity and are utterly powerless against them. Even the much vaunted book, the so-called smoking gun that reveals all, The Day After Roswell, is a prime example of this subterfuge. Something that is often downplayed is the fact that the main source of information was the late Colonel Philip Corso, who was in the intelligence services during World War II and had a hand in enabling Project Paperclip, which allowed hundreds of Nazi scientists to flee from Germany to the USA, where they were granted immunity from their war crimes in exchange for their scientific knowledge. It was in the interests of the USA to say that all the technology that suddenly appeared came from crashed ET spacecraft rather than the Nazi war machine. Because how could the leaders of the free world admit that this marvelous technology now in their possession, the transistors, lasers and fiber optics, etc., came from former Nazi sources? Much easier to attribute it to an off-world source. Government files on the UFO enigma continue to surface. One of the more recent examples was the release of formerly classified information from the UK intelligence services in the Ministry of Defense. But nowhere in the files is there any evidence that the sightings and encounters are necessarily extraterrestrial. Even stonewall cases like the Rendlesham Forest incident of the 1980s, despite the witness evidence being overwhelming, are brushed off using various dubious excuses. All that these reports were able to say was, officially at least, and despite the fact that the intelligence agencies regularly used ufology as a screen to conceal their own agendas, there was no truth in any of it, and the UFO phenomenon lay entirely in the minds of the general public. That it was founded on little more than overactive imaginations and mistaken identity, compounded with a desire for dramatic mystery and intrigue. It is possible that some of this subterfuge might have stemmed from a real fear, that to admit that we really were visited by non-human races originating outside our solar system might create widespread fear, panic, and civil disorder. It is also likely to have caused many people to question the authority and moral certainty of the churches, something that would serve to further exacerbate an increasingly unstable situation. But what if the ongoing sightings are based on something all too real? And what if these craft have a sinister agenda? There is another worrying aspect to all of this, because there can be little doubt that the military will be closely monitoring all things UFO with a view to weaponizing any technology it can obtain from these craft. Even more disconcerting is the possibility that the beings piloting the craft might actually be supernatural, almost magical entities like the fallen angels or elemental beings. And could their technology, actions, and capabilities also be weaponized? However, despite the artifice and denials, there is the ever-present suspicion that their investigations revealed that at least some UFOs might be genuine, and this knowledge could somehow be harnessed for military advantage. This is likely true because, given the ultra-pragmatic way in which intelligence agencies operate, especially the CIA, obtaining anything they think will be of use to their country's military becomes imperative. So how and where they obtain this information is secondary to the methods used. The end invariably justifies the means. Since any information would have to be thoroughly evaluated, monitored, and processed in a dispassionate manner, a guidance group was formed comprising representatives of all interested parties. In the USA, since all branches of the military as well as the Defense Intelligence Agency were obviously involved anyway, it was a relatively simple matter to draft in representatives under the stewardship of, initially, the FBI, then the omnipresent CIA, and eventually perhaps the NSA as well. This semi-official subgroup, which was created in July 1952, allegedly became nicknamed by those involved as the Collins Elite. Although it started out evaluating the threat of UFOs as one based on actual machines, given the makeup and views held by influential members of this group, this changed dramatically, and the first question to ask was, is there any truth in what they believed? And could the CIA have accepted their conclusions and allowed their theories to be further explored? According to a book, Final Events, written by author and researcher Nick Redfern, a British citizen currently residing in the USA, the answer is yes, they could. For many years, the CIA was not only out of control, it was beyond control, and functioned more or less autonomously as a separate government that was a law entirely unto itself, something greatly helped by its lavish and often unaccountable funding. Even their notional boss, the President of the USA, had no idea what was going on, and given some of the dark and frequently murderous operations they instigated and sometimes funded, this was probably just as well. It is a process called plausible deniability, a term first used by the CIA during the Kennedy administration. Regarding the way in which the CIA operated, it has been stated that when Area 51 was first created, it was handed to the CIA to control, rather than the Navy or the Air Force, and in 1958, the then President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The president had made the mistake of allowing the base to function outside his jurisdiction, and was flatly denied both access to the base and information regarding its directives. In retaliation, the president promptly threatened to send in the army and to take the place apart. As a result of this, he was grudgingly given the information he requested, but he never actually managed to gain full control of the base back from the CIA. In regards to Area 51, it is but one of several locations close to the Nevada Test and Training Range, which covers some 2.9 million acres of land, and it was especially created to develop first the U-2 spy plane, then its successor, the still astonishing SR-71. Area 51 on its own covers some 570 square miles, and was also used in the early stages of the U.S. nuclear weapons program for dozens of nuclear blasts. Redfern goes on to state that the findings of the Collins elite strongly inferred that the ET presence was not just the result of visits by nuts and bolts flying craft, and in their view, it was nefarious, demonic, or satanic instead. In fact, it went as far to say categorically that there was never any contact between extraterrestrials and humans. It has always been with supernatural and/or demonic forces. We should remember that this covert unit, which started out with a fairly specific agenda, rapidly became influenced by some of its more single-minded members, who may themselves have been implementing an agenda directed from outside the group. Strangely enough, this opinion mirrors comments made by the late ethnobotanist and psychonaut Dr. Terence McKenna, who once said that we are part of a symbiotic relationship with something which disguises itself as an extraterrestrial invasion so as not to alarm us. He never revealed the details of this observation, but it probably refers to the entities, which he sometimes called machine elves, frequently seen by people who use substances like dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the active ingredient of the traditional and powerful hallucinogen ayahuasca. This would certainly fit with the observations made by members of the Collins elite, and this scope of thinking is surprisingly common in areas of the UFO community who see the phenomenon as more akin to the occult than anything physical. It is a view also shared by some members of the fundamentalist Christian wing of American politics, and in some cases, They have claimed that UFOs were piloted, not by demons, but by angels as an adjunct to the much prophesized end times. Some of them also accept the Bible as the revealed Word of God, which cannot be interpreted in any other way than it is written. However, the astute observation made by Dr. McKenna fits exactly with a statement allegedly made by the Collins elite to the effect that we have in our midst a cold-hearted and sinister intelligence of demonic origins that masquerades as alien. Although the wording is slightly different, the meaning is identical. Before we examine the Collins elite in more detail, we should consider some of the background, and this involves looking at other, less well-known projects undertaken by the CIA and the other U.S. intelligence agencies, as well as investigating the possibility that the Earth was being visited more or less at will by non-human entities. They were also extremely interested in highly controversial occult experiments being carried out by a pioneering rocket scientist and co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, Jack Parsons, and the originator of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, both devotees of the last great magician and occultist, Aleister Crowley himself. In a way, the unlikely connection between the military and magic is not all that surprising, as it resonates with claims made a couple of decades earlier about the Nazi high command during the Second World War, and the reality that they too were involved in magical rituals based on esoteric research into the origins of the Aryan race. This research was conducted by covert quasi-scientific groups like the Ahnenerbe, which was founded in 1935 by SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. Whether or not any of this information was used as part of the Nazi master plan for victory in World War II is unclear, but there is no doubt that Himmler and his associates had very bizarre ideas about how this knowledge might be weaponized. A classification also used by the Pitoganis to delve into the days of the occult, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, made known by the release of 1,500 pages of UFO-related research via the Freedom of Information Act. This ties into similar claims made in the book The Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft, an extremely controversial publication first released in 1972, that the lance that pierced the side of Christ on the cross in St. John's account of the crucifixion was eventually acquired by Hitler in an attempt to use its supposed immense latent power using some unspecified method in his plan for world domination. It may be that given the reputation of the power of the spear, just having it in his possession might have enabled victory. However, according to the legend, losing the spear resulted in the death of whoever possessed it, a legend that seems to have been fulfilled when Hitler finally shot himself in the head with a pistol, although his demise is still shrouded in debate. In the case of the aforementioned Parsons and Hubbard, in 1946 and 47, they attempted to create a magical interdimensional portal to allow a divine feminine archetype, in fact the goddess Babylon, access into our reality. Other opinions hold that it was not any goddess, but some kind of demonic child. They did this using the Babylon working, which was a variation of a ritual that had been attempted 50 years previously by the noted late Victorian British occultist Aleister Crowley, when he used a ritual called the Alamantra working. It may be relevant that Crowley manifested an entity he called Lamb while undertaking this project, and there is no question that Lamb looks remarkably like an alien Grey, and that it was after Lamb's appearance that these and other beings started to be seen on a regular basis when alleged contact with ETs took place. Crowley was well aware of what the two men were attempting and warned Parsons about his deep mistrust of Hubbard and his motives, whatever they may have been. Crowley had a great fondness for Parsons, who he regarded as an adept of his brand of magic. It would be even closer to the truth to say that he thought of Jack Parsons as the son he never had. In a strange example of likely synchronicity, Parsons died at home in 1952 when a mysterious explosion in his garage ended his life. It has been suggested that the explosion was due to his experiments with highly volatile chemicals involved in making rocket fuel. This was, after all, what he did for a living. So either that, or, as has also been implied, he was trying to create a homunculus, or a magical artificial being, and his experiments went horribly wrong, as is often the case for those who delve into the ways of the occult. Either way, he died. Again, we should pause to consider whether or not any of this is feasible, because if fractures in the nature of reality can be brought about by the use of words, symbols, and ritual, this may find a parallel resonance with the arcane symbols and formula used by quantum physicists in the present day. Examples of this can be found in the laboratories where such strange, albeit cutting-edge experiments are carried out, as there is evidence that what the participants in these experiments consciously think can directly affect the outcome of the experiment in ways we don't understand. One example is known as observer effect, and much to the annoyance of the hardline rationalists is proven to occur, meaning that the participants can perceive future events or describe places and things that they have not been exposed to prior, and there is no obvious answer why, or at least not one that they find acceptable. This, by any measure, indicates that the observer effect is a form of magic, the very thing that physicists would adamantly reject. But how else to explain it? Crowley seems to have summed up several decades earlier when he defined magic as the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. In effect, the ability to alter reality. Once again, it seems surprising that the intelligence agencies would involve themselves in such arcane practices, because one would imagine that, as the hard-headed realists they have to be, they would dismiss this as sheer fantasy, but not so. One can reference the Stargate project, which involved, among other things, remote viewing and other physically inspired attempts to gain an advantage over a perceived enemy, as an example of the depths to which these agencies will aspire to obtain any advantage over the enemy, whoever they may be. However, it is at this point we find ourselves slipping into other parallel claims of mind-bending experiments allegedly conducted at places like Montauk on Long Island, and we have to be careful before dismissing this as sheer conjecture or urban conspiracy. Because for no other reason than there was a military base at Montauk, and its remains are still there to this day, and, some people say, also the unintentional remnants and residue of the experiments conducted there. These experiments seem to interlink closely with certain occult and magical practices involving time travel amongst claims of contact with entities that did not originate in this reality. So, how does the Collins elite tie into this? If we consider that this group was set up to see if any military advantage could be gleaned from contact with extraterrestrials, and came to the conclusion that these entities were not ET but demonic, we can also assume that they were prepared to do whatever it took to access and gain this advantage. Among the projects bordering on psychic magic being undertaken was the development of such devices as psychotronic weapons, which could allow the remote influencing of how individuals operate and think, plus a range of other technologies that at first seem impossible. By our standards, they are. And that includes various spin-offs from work already being conducted on other types of electromagnetic weapons. But once you enter into the depths of the dark world of magic, it seems that literally anything becomes possible. As an adjunct to this, there was another sinister CIA-funded mind control project called MK Often, an adjunct to the better-known and equally notorious MK Ultra. For MK Often, the CIA employed the services of Satanists, witches, psychics, and other occultists as part of their efforts in MK Ultra at establishing a reliable and effective method of mind control. This being the case, then, it is entirely feasible that they would plumb any depths necessary in their search for the ultimate military advantage. As if this was not enough, there are claims by Catholic researchers that the Vatican has, or at least had, plans afoot to prepare its flock for the arrival of an extraterrestrial savior, which seems to resonate with the idea that Jesus was an ET. Again, we have this odd synchronistic link between aliens and angels, and the notion that the human race is the result of extraterrestrial DNA splicing. It seems logical that an organization as powerful and influential as the Vatican must have some sort of plan in place to deal with the possibility that if there is life on other planets, and that life has no concept of a creator God, what happens then? It has been seriously mooted by the Curia that in that case, it is the duty of the Church to make them aware of God and bring them salvation. Again, much of this, although it may indeed have elements of fact, is also based on hearsay. It's rather like the so-called evidence for the reality of UFOs, and especially secret underground bases that comes from high-ranking, but almost always unnamed service personnel who dare not reveal their identities for fear of deadly reprisals. This evidence might as well not be quoted, for it cannot be confirmed. In truth, it is evidence of speculation, but for now, that will have to do. However, it is a fact that Pope John Paul, on the 23rd of October, 1996, while speaking to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences plenary session at the Vatican, stated that Darwin's theory of evolution was a reality, and in doing so, reduced the biblical accounts of how we got here to nothing more than myth. How this will play out in years to come remains to be seen, but as a word of caution, according to the prophecies of the Irish Saint Malachi, the Pope coming after Pope Benedict, i.e. Pope Francis, will be the last one, and what comes after that is anyone's guess. But according to Saint Malachi, it is indeed the end times. From what we have seen, it may likely be that the Collins elite is real and still exists, and their task was to monitor any attempts at making contact with whatever exists on the other side of our reality, be it extraterrestrial, ultra-dimensional, or supernatural. If that is the case, then they would have been extremely interested in what the likes of Jack Parsons and Hubbard and others were attempting to do. As already stated, it would not have mattered where this information originated or how it was obtained, as long as military or clandestine factors could harness and make effective use of it. One of the papers that allegedly came from this group was entitled Deception and UFOs: What We Believe and Why, which emerged in 1998 and contains an abbreviated version of their findings since they were founded in 1952. What this document says is that planet Earth is being prepared for Armageddon, and that human beings only serve as mere containers for souls that can be harvested later in the service of Satan. According to them, the only way to salvation is to embrace Christ as your Redeemer and refrain from dark thoughts and concepts being the best line of defense. It is also very interesting that Bob Lazar, who famously claimed to have been hired to back-engineer crashed alien craft at ASI, purportedly has read internal reports that stated the aliens referred to humans as containers. One of the strangest aspects of what came under their oversight was the possibility that a project was already underway, driven by these non-humans, to create hybrids of humans and aliens to serve the Antichrist and Satan during the end times, the time of Armageddon, in fact. And this is where UFOs come back into the equation. Never forget that the fundamentalist Christians discussed earlier fully accept this as an unarguable fact, which, along with the rapture, where all true believers will be physically taken aloft into heaven to sit with God, can and will happen, and, incredibly, even the ultra-rational and frequently mechanistic realm of science has its fair share of believers. So yes, the Collins elite probably are real and do exist, for in the murky world of intelligence gathering and secret black programs, anything that works, however distasteful, can and will be used, although this knowledge is seldom, if ever, on public display. This is in essence how black projects work. The future is set to be revealed, but reality itself seems to be changing at an accelerated rate like never before. And perhaps it's time to step back and expand our perspectives about the unknown realms previously deemed fantastic.